We've already formed a quorum, and it's also time for us to start. Please invite the officials to come in.
啲官員嚟之前呢，我哋進行議程第一項。
Before the officials come in, let's proceed with item 1 on the agenda. At our meeting on the 27th of January, members raised some issues and the administration has submitted a response. It's paper 527-02. The Chinese version has already been distributed to you last Friday, and the Chinese version is tabled. The administration will supplement on those answers. Again, they're tabled. Deputy Secretary or Commissioner, would you like to take us through the paper? Sorry, the speaker is not coming through. Concerning the composition of the IA and the consultation committee, the advisory committee, last time members asked whether or not we should have a minimum threshold of 25% representation from the industry. But there are also views to the effect that that shouldn't be the case because the IIA is a regulatory body, so there shouldn't be such a threshold. The IIA will have a chairman, a chief executive, and 6 directors, at least one with experience and knowledge on the insurance industry. As regards the issues raised at the last meeting, I defer to the Commissioner. Commissioner, thank you, Chairman. At the last meeting, members were concerned about the saving clauses on the part of insurance companies. So what will happen if there are no such clauses? In our reply, we already explained that under Section 16 of the ordinance, insurance companies, in relation to their businesses, will have to keep the records 7 years after the completion of the transaction because all books are involved. Take, for example, for an insurance company, its proceeds all originate from premium. So records of all transactions must be kept. Therefore, insurance policies and all materials have to be kept. Besides, payments, claims, compensation, and debts should also be kept. Take, for example, premium will be used to calculate its liability and debts. So the law stipulates that all transactions related to their businesses have to be kept. As regards insurance policies, so long they are valid, they have to kept until 7 years after the termination of the policies. Now, these provisions has been in place for a long time, and they will remain. After this amendment exercise, there will be a sanction. If any insurance company has not complied with that provision, it's a breach of the law, and a level 5 fine can be handed down. So there is this statutory requirement as well as consequence. Apart from the insurance company's ordinance, we have similar provisions in other legislations like the company's ordinance and inland revenue ordinance. I won't dwell on the details. Anyway, apart from the books, including the component parts of the books, will have to be kept for at least 7 years. So all these are statutory requirements. Mr. Sin was concerned about this at the last meeting, so I hope we've already addressed that concern. Members, do you have any questions on the two papers? Mr. Sin Chung Kai? Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank the administration's representatives for their responses in those two papers. But let me also respond further. As for the requirements on directors, I do understand the provisions in relation to the 2-year requirement, or at least 2 non-executive directors. So I intend to amend that proposal, but there'll be 2 options. One is to delete the words "at least." That means 2 non-executive directors will be required. Now, that's my opinion. You don't need to respond. As regards the retention of business records, as this is already an existing provision, and 16.4 of the marked up copy is actually citing this part of the ordinance. That is, there is a requirement in relation to the retention of business records. And of course, there are also extended provisions. Is it clause 15 or 14 of the bill? What about the auditor's records? Anything in relation to 16.4? Would you require auditors to satisfy 16.4? Do you have such a power to require the auditors to do so? If not, can you yourselves do that? Of course, if something happens, you can ask for the production of records. And then what if there is a breach of 16.4? What will be the penalty? I don't seem to see it here. Commissioner, concerning the auditors, we actually have auditors' guidelines from the Institute of Certified Public Accountants. Apart from the books and records, the source of income and expenditure, assets and liability, etc., etc., all detailed particulars in relation to their businesses will have to be retained. So auditors will have to follow those guidelines. So again, there are similar requirements. If there's something improper, we can raise with the Institute that there is a query on the professional conduct of the auditor concerned. And then in Section 16, what does it cover? Is actually in 16.2. All transactions will have to be included. All transactions. So all information will have to be kept. And then in 4, it is stipulated that the records, the insurance policies will have to be retained right from the start of the policy to 7 years after the termination of the policy. That's for insurance companies, and for auditors, they also have their own guidelines. What if there is a breach of the law? Now, in 26(1)(b)(1), it is stipulated that if the requirement is not satisfied, that will constitute a reason for us to intervene. At the moment, in the bill, we propose an amendment to the effect that if any party falls short of satisfying the retention requirements for business records, a penalty of up to level 5 fine can be handed down. And 17(1)(b), the new clause, will stipulate a breach on the part of the insurance company. And of course, the insurance company concerned can be penalized. and the controlling officers of the company concerned, in accordance with the applicability and severity of the offense, can be sanctioned as well. For example, we can oppose to those persons continue to serve on those officers. So for the senior officers of the insurance company, they will also be affected. For the new 16.5, you have added in penalty. You're actually exercising your power under Section 26, correct? Yes. Given your practical experience, can you tell us, in your past investigation, in the execution of 16.4, did you ever discover that an insurer had failed to keep those records required? Did you ever discover incomplete records? No, we did not have such cases. Insurers all understand the requirements of the ordinance. As I said, the same requirements are found in the company's ordinance and the Inland Revenue Ordinance. All insurance policies and all documentary correspondence with the insured, etc., will have to be retained. In our random checks, field inspections, or investigations resulting from complaints, we had never detected any problems. I'd like to thank the Commissioner for her introduction. One final question for this part. Now, you're going to regulate insurance companies. Now, this is a general question. For the intermediaries, like brokers, are there any requirements for retention of business records? For brokers, my understanding is that they represent purchasers of services to purchase services. The services may be directly sold to the purchasers of services. The brokers and intermediaries, do you have any requirement for retention of business records? Do you consider that necessary? Does a broker need to retain business records? Commissioner, at the moment we have a self-regulatory system. Therefore, our laws may not have covered everything. Generally, they're required to keep records. For the brokers, the final insurance policies are agreements between the insurance companies, that is, the insurers and the insured. So the insurers do have an obligation to retain the business records. In future, intermediaries will be licensed. Therefore, our requirements on brokers and intermediaries will come under that part on intermediaries. When we come to that, we'll look at the detailed requirements. But for the time being, we're looking at the insurers. Where are we? We're just after 110. I just want to note which section we're on. Commissioner, which part will be related to intermediaries and brokers? So, Mr. Sin want to put this on record.
Mr. Sin, from my own experience, those intermediaries or brokers, they would do their best to keep the business records since they are following up on the insurance policies. And as such, the brokers rely on such records for their business. So actually, a lot of brokers would contact the customers even before the insurers in order to not lose any business. That's all right. I just want to see if there's any requirement. We didn't have such requirements before. in the past, the client have had direct relationships with the insurer rather than the intermediary. Have you identified the relevant section in the bill? We are looking at Part 3 as far as intermediaries are concerned. So when we reach that part, we can discuss in detail. Which page are we looking at? After 1940, after page 1940, and after that we can talk about the intermediaries. Any other questions, Mr. Ng Leung Sing? I have a question on section 115, 41B, on the record lookups. We haven't reached that part yet. We are looking at page 115, section 15, section 55 of the bill, second part of the marked up copy. You can follow up with your question later on. Deputy Secretary, are you going to take us through the amendment? I will continue with the clause-by-clause examination. Last time we finished page 115, if I'm not taken wrongly. On page 114 to 119, it's about the new section 41A to 41O. It's about the power of investigation and record checking. A lot of the clauses actually respond to each other. So let's come back to 114, and we will walk everyone through to 119. Thank you, Chairman. On the under 14.1b, the power to conduct inspection, we stipulated the situations in which the IIA can conduct inspections. They would check whether the insurers have followed the requirements and whether they have satisfied the licensing conditions. And these authorization conditions and regulations have been covered. And during these inspections, the IIA can empower its staff to conduct these checks. And the inspectors can visit premises of the insurers, and they can also make copies of relevant documents. And at the same time, they can also ask questions of the staff of the insurance companies, as long as they are related to the regulations. And under the bill, the inspectors have to first obtain information from the insurance company staff, and if this fails, they can request such information from other people. So we do have a mechanism in place. And as they secure this information, these inspectors are allowed to ask the relevant people to submit the documents within a specified time frame. And when they ask questions, if the if the persons being asked said that they cannot provide such information, then the inspector would have the right to ask them to make a declaration to declare that they do not have such information. And the persons being asked, after they give oral accounts, the inspector can also ask them to make a declaration to prove that their statements have been correct and honest. So these are the powers of the inspector. And in case of non-cooperation, for instance, if the relevant staff know such information and yet they refuse to hand it over to the inspector, or in some cases, they might make some misleading accounts to prevent the inspector from obtaining the correct information. Under such circumstances, these constitute criminal offenses. And the IIA also has the power, and when the relevant persons cannot provide a logical reason on why they cannot provide such information, the IIA can apply for an inquiry right from the court. And as such, the relevant persons have to respond to the court whether they really do not know the relevant information. If the court is convinced that the relevant persons are not in possession of such information, then it's okay. But if the court is convinced that there is no sound reason for non-cooperation, then the court can issue an instruction empowering the inspector to obtain such information from the insurer. If after the warrant is issued by the courts, the insurer would be subject to criminal consequences, and they would be subjected to fines or penalties. And during the course of inspection, if the IIA rightfully believes that the insurer is in violation of the insurance company's ordinance, or if it suspects any fraud or foul play, or if the IIA receives any complaints about the insurer, it would have the right to launch an investigation. And the IIA would have the rights I mentioned, for instance, the right to obtain documents and information, the right to interrogate relevant persons, the right to request the submission of certain information within a specified time frame. And in some extreme consequences, for instance, in case of destruction of evidence, it would be criminal in nature. Investigation and inspections without any warrants issued by the warrants, and the IA can also apply for an inspection warrant from the tribunal to enter certain premises, and the premises must be specified by the warrant so that the inspectors can carry out the inspectors or investigations. And the warrant issued by the tribunal also empowers the IIA to take away certain records or documents, and in this case, the IIA can retain the records for up to 6 months. In some cases, they might launch criminal prosecutions, and they might sue the relevant persons or companies. And during the inspections, in some more complicated scenarios, we might require a number of experts as we investigate the insurance company. So we do have provisions in place which might require electrical funding for the IIA to carry out the investigation. And after the investigation, any criminal, in case of any criminal prosecutions, the court can require the insurers to repay the IIA, and the amounts of money must not exceed the funding amount approved by the Legislative Council, and this money will go back towards public money as endorsed by the Financial Secretary. So these were some of the possible scenarios. So perhaps I will stop here and see if there's any question from members. Mr. Sin Chung Kai. For me, this is rather complicated, so I will ask my question part by part. First of all, on the inspection. First of all, I will ask about inspection, and then I will ask about investigation. And on entering the premises, you mentioned that you mentioned authorized insurers. So the insurers refer to companies, right? By entering the premises, do you refer to premises with registered addresses? Will you enter any private premises or properties? Chairman, we can look at 41B bracket 2A. An inspector may enter any premises used by the authorized insurer. So we would be referring to companies because individuals cannot operate an insurance business. And any premises used by the authorized insurer in connection with its business. So oftentimes we are referring to commercial premises. In some cases, if we need to enter any residential premises, we must obtain a warrant first from the tribunal. And the inspectors or investigators assigned by IIA must provide an oath to the court saying that they have reasonable suspicions and that they have to explain why they have to enter the relevant premises, and when they apply for the warrant, they have to specify the exact address of the premises. So it's the same as other warrants, right? Yes, in a way. And then this requirement is similar to the provisions under the MPF ordinance and the money laundering ordinance. Chairman, if you don't mind, perhaps you can give each member 5 minutes. If you allow me to ask, if you allow me 20 minutes, I can do it. Well, it's up to you. Under clause 2 or subsection 2, it mentioned reasonable time. What does it mean by any reasonable time? Does it refer to working hours? Does it mean that you can perform any spot checks within office hours, or would they only be spot checks? By any reasonable time, we are not necessarily looking at office hours, but we can only interpret it through common sense. When you look at 41B, subsection 3B, within the time and at the place specified in the requirement, the inspector can require an insurer to submit its business records. 41B, subsection 3. We're looking at page 116. 41B, subsection 3B. Within the time and at the place specified in the requirement. Would any prior notice be given, or can it be spot checks? Under the ordinance, we did not specify that we have to give prior notice. So you have the right to give spot checks, right? Yes. Chairman, our normal practice is that we would inform the insurer first before we come in order to facilitate everyone. And we would notify them of our arrangements and the kind of documents we will look at, etc. That is our normal practice when we conduct spot checks. Usually, we will carry out these checks during office hours, but in some special circumstances, for instance, in urgent cases, if we need to conduct checks, we might not give notice. But the normal practice is that we would notify them of our arrangements first.
So we'll see what need to be spot checked, so they understand what systems we have and what documents would be required. Now this is to facilitate all parties concerned. So that's what we mean by reasonable. Under normal circumstances, we would like to give them time to make preparation. But of course, if you're talking about special cases, then we may have to have special arrangements. Mr. Ng Leung Sing. Mr. Chairman, I'd also like to know more about this inspection. What is the difference between inspection and investigation? Any subordination relation herein? Well, for an inspection, as set out in page 116, the requirement is rather lenient. That is to appoint somebody as an inspector. Any person, any class of persons. Well, it reads rather clumsy. Anyway, any person will suffice. That's my understanding. Apparently, there are no requirements in relation to qualifications or eligibility. Will you give people an impression that this is very lenient? There are no specific requirements. Well, sometimes we do see the word qualified. For example, persons with basic knowledge in the insurance industry. And just now, for the investigator, the administration explained 41D2. The costs and expenses incurred by an investigator may be paid out of monies provided by the LegCo. Apparently, the inspector won't incur any cost or expenses. Have you left out anything? And what about monies provided by the LegCo? If you don't have many investigators and if the sums involved are not huge, why shouldn't those be covered by the IIA? Or do you mean that normally you don't have investigators where and when necessary you have to apply for funding? If that's the case, it will be rather complicated. Well, let's not talk about hindrance or obstruction. More trivialities may be involved. Well, Mr. Ng asked a number of questions. Please answer them one by one. Yes, Mr. Chairman. Let me say something about inspection and investigation in general. 41B1 spells out the normal inspection. That is, if there's no irregularities, we can carry out an inspection, normal inspection. But 41D spells out very clearly that if the authority has reasonable cause to believe that the ordinance is contravened or defalcation, fraud, misfeasance, etc., of the person may be involved. So that's basically the difference between an inspection and an investigation. Mr. Ng asked something about drafting. Well, the authority can appoint any person, say, for example, an accountant. We need to know clearly possible fraud and irregularities on the part of the insurers. We may need to enlist assistance from professional accountants so as to do investigation in terms of accountancy. So we may have to appoint somebody in the profession. Page 118 of the marked up copy 41D2. The costs and expenses incurred by an investigator other than an employee of the authority may be paid out of monies provided by the LegCo, be it inspector or investigator. He or she is normally an employee of the authority. So why do we need this provision and the expression other than an employee of the authority? Complicated cases may warrant the forensic auditing of professional accountants. Then certain costs and expenses may be incurred. Then we may need to have extra funding. So we're talking about such circumstances. We're not talking about normal investigations upon receipt of complaints. Prima facie, from the letters, you only require extra funding for people other than authorities' employees. So normally you have your own employees to do the job, but for special cases you may need to apply for extra funding. I think the procedures that you have to go through will be problematic because such investigations may have a time limit. There is a certain element of urgency in it. Otherwise, the costs and expenses will have been covered by the authority already. If there is a certain investigation, even though the number of investigators may not be that many, you may have to apply for extra funding from the LegCo. Is this really reasonable? And for inspections, apparently, to execute this provision, when you need an inspector, you can in writing appoint a person or any class of persons as the inspector. So this will fall beyond the normal operations of the authority. So basically you have to, in writing, appoint any person. That's what's written here. Apparently you've not included this in your recurrent expenses. That means you have to go beyond the authority to find somebody to help you. But this is inspection only. I mean ordinary audit only, to see whether a certain party has the power to do something. Even not for undercover operations. These inspections will not be occasional in nature. They'll be normal and general in nature. So if you don't cover those inspections under your budget, you may have to apply for extra funding. Well, maybe I need to set a speaking time limit for members. I think, Mr. Ng, you're rather long-winded just now. That means for normal inspections, their own employees can do all the job. I think Mr. Ng was correct. Even if it is an investigator, if there is an urgent case, if incidentally you face filibustering in this council, then there may be a delay. Well, I think there is a misunderstanding here. Just look at the provisions here. First of all, the authority is a statutory body. As I said just now, we have directors in the board of directors. We don't need the chairman or the members to do inspection or investigation. That means the IIA will have to appoint somebody to do inspection, and the appointments must be in writing. If the inspector is to enter a premises to conduct an inspection, first of all, evidence of appointment must be produced to those parties who are to be inspected. Normally, these are the employees of the authority. For normal inspections, the law is clear. That is to see whether the party has followed all the statutory provisions and guidelines and conditions set by the IIA. Just now we mentioned special behavior like misfeasance, fraud, misconduct, and so forth, defalcation, etc. So these are not uncommon nowadays. So the IIA, when faced with such cases, will need to enlist assistance from the professional auditors and accountants, for example. This does not mean that we have to come to LegCo for funding, even for our normal expenses. Perhaps I can help here. In 41B6, we mention any person or a person, but not employee. So Mr. Ng Leung Sing doubted if this is the employee, but actually it should be the employee of the authority. Now we can go back and re-examine this. In actual circumstances, normally an inspection will be conducted by an employee or employees of the authority. At the moment, inspections are carried out by my colleagues, for example. Will there be occasions on which we need other persons to help? For example, during a financial crisis, we may need to conduct more frequent inspections. Well, that's an assumption only. And we have experienced such occasions. In future, if the IIA has to carry out such frequent inspections, it may not have sufficient manpower. Then it may have to appoint persons like auditors to inspect this company or that company and what to inspect, etc., with more frequent inspections. So when there are more frequent inspections, they may not have sufficient manpower. But the authority does not necessarily have to employ more people. So sometimes the authority may have to, in writing, appoint a person or a person belonging to a class of persons to conduct inspections. So for 41D, it's investigation, and it's only with reasonable causes for an investigation that an investigation will be conducted.
Under 41D 1B, the authority can instruct one or more employees with the consent from the financial secretary. The authority can assign external investigators to continue with the investigation exercise. And what Mr. Ng said is that the funds may be provided by the Legislative Council, and in case the investigation is very extensive in scale and that the cost cannot be covered by recurrent expenses, it can obtain funding by the Legislative Council, but it's not mandatory, so there is some flexibility. If the IIA can cover the investigation with its own budget, then it would not have to apply for the funding. So that's why we use the word may in the English version. I understand that there's some difference in both versions, and in one version, employee is specified while the other it's not. But the gist is that most of the work would be done by the employees, and external investigators would only be commissioned in complicated cases with the approval of the financial secretary. I want to make another point. Under 41B, bracket 6, it says the authority may, in writing, appoint a person or a person belonging to a class of persons as an inspector. From what I understand of what Mr. Ng said, this is not redundant, because when you look at if the English version says anyone or any person, it already covers all classes of persons. So any persons have been included. So why do you have to say a person belonging to a class of persons? This is rather redundant. Deputy Secretary and Commission, perhaps you'll go back and look at it. This is rather redundant. When we looked at the Chinese version before, we would try to, we would always simplify these clumsy clauses and make it as simple and direct as possible, because any person already includes basically anyone. Well, Mr. Raymond Wong's not here, otherwise he might have something to say. We will go back and look at the wording again. The legal counsel, please go back and think about it. You don't necessarily have to follow what was written in the past. And application of funding from the Legislative Council, this is something I understand, because for complicated cases in the future, IIA might not be able to conduct the exercises using itself alone, especially in cases such as multinational fraud. The cost of investigation might be very, very high, and in such case, the IIA cannot bear the cost itself. So that's why we use the word may. So it may have to apply for funding from the Legislative Council. So this is just for precaution, and for complicated cases or very big cases, if investigation have to stop due to inadequate funds, it would be a problem. So I do have two questions. I have some concern with the words relevant persons, because inspectors or investigators can seek relevant persons for information. And my second question is about the questions that need to be answered by the investigated company. Does it mean that if I remain silent, I would be held liable? So does it mean I have to answer your questions? to be honest, even murderers have the right to remain silent. And that's a basic right. Why are you taking it so seriously here? Why are you asking them to answer your questions? Why are you making it compulsory? So these are my two questions. Chairman, on the term relevant persons, they would only be interrogated if the IAA has ample evidence. Such requests cannot be made unless the IAA has relevant information. And over the course of investigation, the IAA must first obtain the relevant information from the insurance company. If IAA fails to obtain such information from the insurance companies, it can try to obtain them from other persons. So that's the existing system. And for the second question, as the chairman said, over the course of investigation or inspection, the IAA relies heavily on the information provided by such persons. And the procedure is like this. The relevant persons can say they don't know, or they would not say it, and the law would empower the investigator or inspector to request a declaration from the relevant persons to prove that they are not in the knowledge of the information. So if they really do not know, they have the right to say so. They can make a declaration. Commissioner, please let me complete myself. Similar provisions exist in the Securities and Funds Ordinance and the MPF Ordinance with regards to the requirements on intermediaries. MPF intermediaries are not part of the business. But here, under this bill, the scope of coverage is very wide. If anyone suspects that I is suspicious of me, then you have the right to investigate those people. And there's no right to remain silent. They have to speak. You said that the relevant persons can say that they do not know it. So how do you know if they are lying, or what does it mean by lying? So you have to assume everyone is innocent unless you can prove otherwise. But what you're doing now is against the principle of law. You are asking me to make a declaration to show that what I said was honest and correct. Is that the case, Chairman? The IAA inspectors and investigators have the right to do so, to ask the people providing information to show that what they said is accurate and honest. I think this is something members can think about, whether this is a contradiction to the common law system we are adopting. This is not a new clause introduced by us. I don't care whether this is new or not. I wasn't involved in the scrutiny of the SFC ordinance, but for the insurance company's ordinance, I think this practice is against the common law. So this is something I would like members to think about. Mr. Chen Kim-po, excuse me. I just arrived here since I had another meeting. We were talking about page 114 to 117. Page 114 to 119 of the marked up copy, part 2, page 115. Inspection and investigation without warrant. And until the part 2, bracket 3C, you can turn to page 116. On bracket C to answer a question. When inspectors or investigators have questions to ask of the relevant persons, those relevant persons have to give an honest and accurate answer. If the inspector or investigator have any suspicions, the relevant persons must make a declaration to show that they what they said is accurate. So this means the relevant persons have no right to stay silent. They have to speak. You can look at the relevant clause. They have to answer the questions being asked. So I'm rather skeptical of this requirement. When we talk about criminal cases, even for or murders, murderers can still stay silent. But here, if you stay silent, it's against the law. So I think this is against the principle of the common law. You have to assume a person is innocent until you prove otherwise, and they should have the right to remain silent. When you look at the SFC ordinance or MPF ordinance, the administration said there are relevant, there are similar ordinances in those or requirements in those ordinances, but I wasn't part of those bills, so that's why I have this question today. Chairman, I agree with your point. In criminal cases, the relevant persons can stay silent, so why can't they do so in such cases? I think in reality, the relevant persons would be happy to work with the IAA to show that their companies are not involved in any foul play. Even if you give them the right to stay silent, they wouldn't do so because they treasure their own licenses, and reputation is very important for them, so they would do their best to show the IIA that they have not done anything wrong. Of course, they wouldn't get in the way of. Of course, I agree with your view on the legal basis, but I just want to say that the relevant persons would do their best to cooperate. I do not question the willingness of the relevant persons to cooperate with IIA because it's something to do with the licenses of the companies. But you have to think about another aspect. But since the term relevant persons is used, even those who are not involved with the companies might be involved. Under 41C of page 117, the inspector may require answer to be verified by statutory declaration. And under page 119, 41E, the investigator may require explanation to be verified by statutory declaration. So can I invite the DOJ to supplement more on the legal viewpoint of the issue?
Mr. Chairman, if you're talking about inspection, On page 116, under bracket 4, there is this saying that unless the inspector has reasonable cause to believe that the information or record being sought cannot be obtained by exercising the power in relation to the authorized insurer, the power under 2C or 3 is not exercisable in relation to a person specified in subsection 5. And subsection 5 means the person specified is a person whom the inspector has reasonable cause to believe has information relating to or is in possession of a business record of the authorized insurer. Well, the chairman mentioned relevant persons and everybody can be covered. Can you tell us where that provision is? So you shouldn't say any person or relevant person or related person, not every relative of your family. The person who is in possession of the information. So this means a person in possession of the information, not everybody, as you said. When the inspector wants to ask questions, then of course he has to ask the person in possession of the information. I think the chairman should clarify his remarks first. Well, in fact, in this bill, there is no such expression as a related person or any relative in the family. Well, it is you who use the expression 相关人士, which means a related person. Oh, Mr. Chairman, maybe I have misled you. In fact, bracket 5 is rather difficult to understand in the Chinese version, so maybe I've used the term 相关人士, related person, and have misled you, the chairman. In fact, I was referring to bracket 5 here. The person is a person whom the inspector has reasonable cause to believe has information relating to or is in possession of a business record of the authorized insurer. Our legal advisor would like to supplement with some legal points. Mr. Chairman mentioned whether there will be any damage to the presumption of innocence principle under the common law. We did study this, but we haven't come to that yet. It's actually 41H, the new 41H, which spells out the restrictions. The investigator has to inform the person before the person gives an answer that the question and answer or explanation of further particulars are not admissible in evidence against the person in criminal proceedings in a court of law. But of course, that should not cover misrepresentation or false evidence. It only means that the person needs not give answers or explanations that may lead to his being convicted in a criminal proceeding in a court of law. At the same time, we need to protect his right to remain silent. So a balance has to be struck, and that point has already been considered during the drafting stage. Now, we'll come back to this when we come to that provision. Well, Mr. Chairman, I'm not as expeditious as you. I'm still on the new clause 41B and new clause 41C. Am I correct to understand that 41C2 does allow the person to remain silent? And then for 41B, the person can remained silent. Yes, the person can say that he does not have the information. Then the inspector can ask him for a statutory declaration to the effect that he does not possess the information and so is unable to provide an answer. Is this statutory declaration the same as an affidavit? 法定聲明 in English is statutory declaration. Under the Criminal Offence Ordinance, a false evidence is to give false evidence is a criminal offence. The person can make a statutory declaration, but if the statutory declaration is false, then we can still prosecute the person for giving false evidence. 5 and 8 and 3 are in doubt. Is my understanding correct? For the inspectors, they have the power to ask the authorized insurers as spelled out in 5. What about these authorized insurers? I mean in bracket 5. Normally, who do you mean? Which persons in the company? Mr. Chairman, Mr. Sin, which provision are you on? 41B? 41B, bracket 5. Second sentence. Or rather the second part of that sentence, or is in possession of a business record of the authorized insurer. Well, in the whole bill, we have a definition for the authorized insurer. First of all, the inspector can request the authorized insurer, that is, an insurance company. Well, maybe the term 保險人 in the Chinese version has created difficulty in understanding. In fact, this insurer is actually an insurance company. Now, the inspector can go to an insurance company to conduct inspection. Well, let us go to 41B bracket 4 first. If the inspector has reasonable cause to believe that he cannot obtain the information from that insurance company, then he can resort to the persons in bracket 5. Now, who are these persons? These are the persons whom the inspector has reasonable cause to believe have information relating to or is in possession of a business record of the insurance company concerned. Now, the first part of bracket 5 mentions the person specified for subsections 2C and 3 is a person blah blah blah. So, who is this person specified? Do you mean an employee in the insurance company concerned? And then the second part of that sentence means somebody in the management of the insurance company. Am I correct? No. If you go back to bracket 3, you see that the inspector may require the authorized insurer or a person specified in subsection 5. Who is the person specified in subsection 5? Is the person I mentioned just now. The person whom the inspector has reasonable cause to believe has information of the insurance company. That means the person specified in bracket 5. So to put it in simple terms, if the inspector has reasonable cause to believe that the person has information related to the authorized insurer, well, that is true, but can you use layman terms to say this? Now, the inspector can inspect an insurance company or other persons, I'll first go to the insurance company. If for reasonable causes I believe that I won't be able to obtain the information from the insurance company, then I can resort to other persons. Now, who are these other persons? These persons are persons whom the inspector has reasonable cause to believe have information relating to the insurance company concerned. That's the logic. All right. Can I give you an example? An inspector or an investigator comes to ask me, Wang Ting Kwong, whether or not I have certain information about an insurance company. In front of him, I can only say yes or no. If I say yes, I'll hand over the information to him. If I say no, then I have to make a statutory declaration to the effect that I don't possess the information. But I cannot remain silent. I must say yes or no. I cannot refuse to say either yes or no. Well, Mr. Chairman, first of all, it's not that simple. First of all, the insurance company has to invite you, the chairman, to undergo the investigation. No, not the insurance company. Oh, sorry, it's the IIA. The IIA must have a reasonable cause to believe that you have the information. That is the premise, the pretext. Say I'm closely related to that insurance company. I may be related to that case. You have a reasonable cause to suspect me, well, maybe because of my ugly look or whatever reason. When you come to investigate me, I can only tell you either I possess the information or not. If I say yes, I possess the information, I have to hand over the information to you. If I say no, then I have to make a statutory declaration. I must say yes or no. I cannot remain silent, right? Otherwise, I'll be breaching the law. Now, Mr. Chairman, you say you've handed over certain documents. No, I did not hand over the documents to you. I just keep silence. I just look foolish. All right. If you keep silence, then the inspector or investigator can do nothing. Say, if there is a narration from you, the investigator or inspector can ask you to make a statutory declaration to verify that what you have said is true. Well, can they do something like police officers? That is, they can just caution me that it's not necessarily for me to answer their questions. I just need to make a statutory declaration. Well, no, it's not for you to say that you want to make a statutory declaration. It's for the inspector or investigator to ask you to do that. And we're not yet talking about a criminal case. Just now, the DOJ representative did say that if you say something, and that something may be involved in a criminal proceeding, and you may be criminalized or convicted, then we say that what you say cannot be used as evidence in a criminal proceeding to target you. Well, if I say no, and if I'm willing to make a statutory declaration to say that I don't have the information, then the inspector or investigator may have a reasonable doubt that I'm telling a lie. Then the next step would be to obtain a warrant from the court. And then with a search warrant, they enter my home and discover that I do have the information. Then I'll be giving false evidence. I'll be committing an offense because I've made a statutory declaration to the effect that I don't have the information. So, of course, the person wants to protect himself. Otherwise, he'll be bearing another crime.
Chairman, we can look at page 120, 41F. If a person fails to comply with a requirement imposed by an investigator or inspector, in that case, the inspector or investigator can apply to the court requesting an inquiry. In other words, the court can invite yourself, the chairman, to answer an inquiry, and they would ask you to say yes or no and provide a reason. If the court is convinced that you did not lie, then you will be okay. If the court is convinced that you did lie and that you are trying to deceive the IIA over the course of investigation or inspection, the court can issue an instruction asking you to tell the truth. This is different because this is an instruction issued by the court. If you don't follow the instruction, it's a disrespect to the court. But now I'm talking about an inspector asking me to make a declaration. Procedure-wise, when an inspector or investigator obtains information, well, I just want to make one thing clear. Whether it's an inspection or investigation, when the inspector or investigator comes, do I have the right to remain silent? Do I have such right? Perhaps the DOJ can give more on this. Thank you, Chairman. Chairman, your question was that if an investigator or inspector comes and asks for information, do you have the right to remain silent? May I ask you to turn to page 122, 41G, bracket 6. It says a person is not accused from complying with the requirement imposed on the person under section 41D5 or 41E1 only on the ground that to do so may tend to incriminate the person. If you told us about this subsection earlier, then it's all right. Then we wouldn't have to spend a lot of time. Can you elaborate more? What does this part mean? It's the incrimination of self against against incrimination of self. The power does not apply to the investigation phase. But the person being inspected would have the right to remain silent. For investigations, as we mentioned in 41H, we do have a clause to balance the interests. And even if a person being inspected chooses to remain silent, we cannot use this fact against this person as legal evidence. You can look at 41H. Which subsection are you referring to? The heading is called Use of Incriminating Evidence in Proceedings 1. If an investigator requires a person to give an answer to a question, the investigation must ensure that the person has been informed of the effect of subsection 2. And bracket 2A and B on page 124. If an investigator requires a person to give an answer to a question or to give an explanation or further particulars under this part, and it doesn't include the crimes under subsection 3. For instance, when giving false evidence. If a person violates other clauses, those answers cannot be used as evidence against him or her. Chairman, can you clarify? Can you clarify it? Well, I'm trying to ask the Department of Justice through the chairman. As I understand, under 41G bracket 6, does it mean that I cannot be convicted because of the fact that I answered some questions? And 41 and in bracket 6, my answer cannot constitute evidence for other criminal prosecutions. Is that a correct interpretation? Can you give us some examples of similar clauses in other ordinances? And under the SFC ordinance, clause 146 and the money laundering ordinance, as well as section 485 of the MPF ordinance and 22 bracket 2. And I think the ordinances, within the three ordinances she mentioned, two of them were wrong because I was involved in the scrutiny of two of those three ordinances. So this is just a remark. We have some supplementary information in the subsequent clauses. In order to safeguard certain basic rights under the common law system. So I have no more questions with this part. This part we can go on. The speaker is off the mic. Thank you, Chairman. We are looking at page 114 to 119 of the marked up copy, so I have 2 points to make. First of all, the appointment of any persons on page 116 bracket 6. On the appointment of any persons by for the purpose of inspection. When the government clarifies this point, what they said seemed to imply that any persons or any class of persons, I'd like to clarify whether the class of persons refer to someone who is not part of the IIA staff, and in that case, would they have to apply for funding from the Legislative Council? If by a class of persons, if any person or any class of persons if both represents IIA staff under the policy, can you try to simplify the wording? And the second point is also on page 116, bracket 8. And as far as inspection is concerned, the inspectors are required to produce documents. If they require the people being inspected to produce an information, the inspector must produce relevant proof of identity. When we look at page 118, over the course of investigation, there is a similar requirement. Upon request, the investigator must produce the relevant proof of identity or document. But the wording used here seemed to be a bit different. Time-wise and requirement-wise, are these two requirements different in terms of priority. The English version seems to be more accurate, but for the Chinese version, when you look at brackets A on page 116, in brackets 4 on page 118, there is no such requirement. And under bracket 6 on page 116, over the course of inspection, well, the English version is clearer. And in the Chinese version, in brackets 4, it's the words first time is mentioned. The inspector has to provide a proof of identity or document, but on page 118, there's no such word. But for the English version, there are the words when imposing the requirement. The English version says before first imposing a requirement. I hope the government can clarify the purpose of the legislation. Is there any difference in terms of priority and order of importance? Who can address this question? Chairman, maybe I will provide a written answer during the next meeting. We do have certain considerations when we drafted the bill. We thought about the different situations we can encounter during investigations and inspections. So perhaps I will provide a written response for the next meeting. Any other questions? If not, let's continue. So we are done with page 119. Under 41D, brackets 1B, on page 117. 41D. You mentioned fraud, misconducts, deficit, or other improper conduct. I haven't referred to other ordinances, but are the words used here similar to the words used by other authorities? Chairman, the words used are similar as the words used in the SFC ordinance. Under brackets, under C, why are potential policyholders mentioned? By potential policyholders, we refer to persons who have signed contracts with the insurer, and potential policyholders refer to people who are still under negotiation with the insurers. Before we sign a policy, in simple terms, we need the insuree to sign an agreement, and if it's agreed by the insurer, then a contract can be facilitated. So by potential policyholders, we refer to those who are still discussing terms with insurers. So under the ordinance, we often talk about policyholders and potential policyholders. Chairman, I don't know if we have better terms, because I have some doubts with these words.
Well, in fact, in simple terms, everybody is a potential policyholder. A customer relationship has actually started. I don't know whether they have a better expression. the word potential will cover everybody. Do you mean those relations under negotiation, under contact, etc., etc.? No, Mr. Chairman, the scope is not that narrow. Insurance is different from other financial services. Under an insurance policy, you're buying a protection. So very often we're buying a protection. So it's more than a negotiation underway. We include a potential policyholder to allow the IIA in exercising its power to have more flexibility. Say if it wants to investigate, well, let me cite an assumption. An insurance company or some of its agents are involved in certain behavior which may not be breaching the law, but there may be documents or leaflets that are relevant. Well, these people may have had the same behavior on a number of occasions, so we need to investigate. But on certain occasions, business can be concluded, but on other cases, businesses fall through. But irregular conduct needs to be examined. Well, even if he does not succeed in getting a business, we can still investigate to see whether or not there's any breach of statutory requirements. So we're not just referring to successful transactions where the insured has taken out an insurance policy. Maybe there are elements of misrepresentation in documents or leaflets. So we need to examine whether or not there are such conduct. So we would like to give the IIA more flexibility. Well, I don't oppose this expression. You have to take into account public interest, and you can investigate into a number of scenarios. Sorry, I may not have done my homework well enough, but from my recollection, under 41D, there is this stipulation that the authority may, in writing, direct one or more of its employees or with the consent of the financial secretary, appoint one or more other persons to investigate the matter. In fact, in other pieces of legislation, the financial secretary can appoint somebody to conduct an independent investigation. Now here, the authority can conduct investigation, but on other occasions, the financial secretary can instigate or start an investigation, if my memory is correct. Here you say the authority may in writing direct one or more of its employees. Now, the definition of employees is very clear. But in law, what is meant by with the consent of the financial secretary? What's the difference between having the consent of the FS and not having the consent of the FS? Well, Mr. Chairman, I can answer the question. The authority can only direct its own employees, but for persons beyond the authority, such an appointment for investigation can only be made with the consent of the financial secretary. That is, for persons beyond the authority, the consent of the financial secretary must be obtained. I mean, for the appointment of persons beyond the authority for investigation. Can the personnel of the authority conduct investigation. Yes, right from the very beginning of this provision, this is spelled out very clearly. But if other persons are to be appointed for the investigation, then the consent of the FS must be obtained. And of course, the authority has to explain why it has to appoint somebody else. Well, usually the authority will appoint its own employees. But in some cases, persons other than the employees of the authority may have to be appointed to conduct the investigation. And in that case, the consent of the FS is required. Do you understand, Mr. Sin? Well, partly. I somehow remember that in another piece of legislation, the provision is not the same. Well, there are two different issues here. The appointer and the appointee. The appointee can be an employee of the authority or other persons, but the appointer must be the authority or the FS. Well, I understand what Mr. Sin was talking about. In an inspection, the authority can appoint other persons, but here we're talking about an investigation. More in-depth information targeting specific suspicion or doubts is involved. So an investigation is more complicated than an inspection, and the consequences may be more obvious. So for an inspection, usually the authorities' employees can do their job, but if more frequent inspections are required, then the authority can appoint other persons. But then for this new clause that is 41D, there is suspicion or doubt, and an investigation has to be conducted. As the investigation may be broader in coverage, other persons may have to be appointed, and so the FS consent is required. For the powers spelled out in 41D, I'd like to know whether this investigation is something confidential. Now, they have to obtain the consent of the financial secretary first. Is this something confidential? Mr. Chairman, everything related to the inspection or investigation of an insurance company is governed by the rule of confidentiality. When outsiders are appointed by the authority to conduct an investigation or an inspection, they have to abide by the rule of confidentiality. I understand that the investigation must be confidential. The investigators cannot disclose the information to the public. But of course, when there is fraud, defalcation, misfeasance, or other misconduct, the financial secretary may have to do something as a result of public concern or media pressure. Well, this provision is very different from what I saw in other pieces of legislation. From my recollection, the financial secretary can only do one thing. If you want to conduct investigation, if you want to have outsiders to help you, I can agree. But can the financial secretary instruct the authority to conduct investigation? For other pieces of legislation that regulate the other statutory bodies, the provision may be different. Can I have an answer here? Mr. Chairman, perhaps I should explain this to Mr. Sin, whether or not there are other similar provisions to the effect of the consent of the FS is required. In Cap 182, that is the SFC ordinance, the SFC can in writing appoint one or more employees or with the consent of the financial secretary. You mean the expression is the same, or, comma, with the consent of the financial secretary? Yes. And in Cap 615, Anti-Money Laundering Ordinance, in Section 11, bracket 1, there's a similar expression, or common with the consent of the financial secretary, appoint one or more other persons to investigate the matter. So the provisions are the same. What about the other pieces of legislation? Is the financial secretary empowered to instruct the authority concerned to conduct an investigation? Well, we have to look into that in more depth. But similar expressions are found in other pieces of legislation. Maybe next time you give us a written reply on where we can find a similar expression or otherwise. Any other questions? Let us continue then. Well, I'm not really literate. In bracket 6, I just spot this one. Maybe this can be found somewhere else. This Chinese character is used. Also, bracket 6, 1, 有關. What about this 有? Is it the same as 有, which means has? If you look at 41D6, 41D6 is relevant. In recent times, it's more popular to use the word 有, meaning relating to or related to. And then if we use 有關, then for the definite article, the person may be confused. If we say 與 something 有關, then the something in between, if it is too long, the sentence will be difficult to understand. But if we use 有關, I can just use one sentence. I don't need to break 有 and 關. This is something to do with the Chinese version. Well, Mr. Chairman, I've been scrutinizing quite many bills. This word is rather rarely used, so I was a bit scared upon seeing it. You don't need to be scared. An explanation has been offered to you. Can our legal advisor comment? Thank you, Chairman. In fact, all along, in the past few years, the law, the DOJ did change their way of drafting to modernize the draft. I don't have any special comment on the use of the word or the expression 有關. Then we move on to 41E. Mr. Chairman, in fact, we did say that this clause is about the investigator may require explanation, etc., to be verified by statutory declaration. No question. Then we can move on to 41F. If a person fails to comply with a requirement or make a statutory declaration, the IIA can apply to the court for an inquiry. And if the person has no reasonable excuse, that is, if that person is uncooperative with the IIA without reasonable excuse, then the court of first instance can order that person to cooperate with the IIA. If that person does not observe the court order, then there can be punishment similar to the punishment for contempt of court. So you can take somebody to court under 41F, right?
Chairman, the IIA has the power to use this procedure, and it can force this person through the court order to cooperate. And of course, the IIA must have valid reasons before they can file such applications. This is the case, as I understand, right? If we have no other questions, please go on. And for 41G, it's to do with offenses in relation to inspections and investigations, and it mentions different tiers. When you look at the subsections, especially subsection 3, we would see whether why the relevant persons do not provide the information to IIA. If any fraud or intention of fraud is detected, for instance, if any misleading information is provided on purpose, or if any misleading documents are provided, if they submit these documents, even in the knowledge that they are false, then it's a criminal offense. And there are different penalties which are listed on page 123, listed in subsections 8 to 11. And under subsection 8, if a person does not cooperate with the IIA without any valid reason, the fine will be 200,000, and or on summary conviction to a fine at level 5. And under bracket 9, it's on the provision of misleading information, and on conviction on indictment to a fine of 1 million. And on summary conviction to a fine at level 6, the penalties are heavier because the person is providing misleading information. And under subsection 10, it's even the penalties are even heavier because fraud is involved. And on conviction on indictment to a fine of 1 million and to imprisonment for 7 years. And for summary conviction, the fine is at level 6 and imprisonment for 6 months. So members, please take note of these penalties, and any questions are welcome. Mr. Jian-Kim-po, I'd like to go back to page 118, and it says the costs and expenses incurred by an investigator other than an employee of the authority may be paid out of monies provided by the Legislative Council. So in other words, if the investigator does not belong to the staff of IIA, it can apply for funding from LegCo. I guess you are referring to accountants or other experts. But I have a question on the funding provided by the Legislative Council. Is that an annual endowment or or we are talking about funds given on a one-off basis? Are you talking about a one-off endowment or something else? This question has been answered, so perhaps the administration can say it again. Normally speaking, investigations would be taken up by IIA staff. For more complicated cases or cases that require heavy manpower or certain experts like accountants or auditors, IIA would need to commission external investigators. It doesn't mean that they must apply for funding from the Legislative Council. It really depends on the costs incurred. Under special circumstances, our provision provides a chance for them to apply for the funding. That's why we use the word may in the ordinance. If the cost is very high, the IIA can apply to LegCo. So the purpose of this provision is to provide some flexibility. It really depends on the case. They have to obtain approval from the Finance Committee, right? Yes. For very big cases or multinational cases that involve overseas insurance experts, the IIA cannot possibly bear all the costs, so they have to come to LegCo for the money. Let's continue. 41H, under 41G, which subsection? It says any person. I'm talking about 41G. We are looking at 41G, right? The person mentioned would not be a company. It must be an individual, right? No. By a person, as we mentioned, if IIA cannot obtain the information from the insurer, and if they know that other people are in possession of the knowledge, they can make such requests. And if the relevant persons attempt to provide misleading or wrong information, they would be subject to penalties. This applies to the persons I mentioned. It might not be a company. The short answer is that the persons listed under 41D, the persons listed under 41D bracket 6 would apply. So a person refers to those persons under that subsection. Chairman, I cannot really gauge the penalties suggested, whether they are too heavy or too lenient. Can you tell us what your standards are? As I mentioned, the powers to investigate or inspect there are similar. Well, the provisions are the same as the SFC ordinance and the intermediaries regulations in the MPF ordinance. Any questions? If not, let's go on to 41H. As our colleagues at the DOJ said, when the IIA makes an inquiry to a person, the authority cannot use the information collected as incriminating evidence in proceedings. But of course, the information collected can be used in the cases against the insurer. So any questions? If not, let's move on to 41I and J, and that's all for today. 41 is rather simple, but it's very important. It's on the destruction of records. In other words, destroying evidence. The destruction of evidence is a criminal offense, and on conviction, the fine is 1 million and imprisonment for 2 years, and on summary conviction, the fine is level 6 at imprisonment for 6 years. And if after investigation, if a person is convicted, is prosecuted and convicted, the court can order this person to pay the full or partial costs of investigation to the IIA, and in certain and under this situation, the fine by the convicted person to the IIA cannot exceed the amount approved by LegCo. And after, if the IIA recovers the costs, the money must go back to our treasury on the instruction of the financial secretary. Mr. Chen Kim-po. Chairman, I have a question I'd like to confirm with the IIA. On 41A, we talked about it before. The arrangement is not necessary for IIA staff. If you include the cost of everything and everybody, it will be very expensive. So we agree that this only applies to serious cases and not ordinary cases, right? So let's have it on record that this arrangement would not apply to all cases, right? It will only apply to serious cases, right? We provided a document to the Bills Committee last time. It has been mentioned in the document, right? Yes, so we do have it on record. So we only have 2 minutes left. The next item on the agenda is establishing the dates of the next 2 meetings. The next one will be the 3rd of March, 2:30 p.m. The 3rd of March. And then we will have another meeting on the 9th of March, which is a Monday at 8:30 a.m. If there's no other business, the meeting will adjourn.